Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded sovereign lands of the Ngunnawal people, who were the first to suffer the consequences of the colonial violence which continues to be felt by First Nations people and refugees and so many others across this continent. And that First Nations people were also the first to engage in resistance and are continuing to lead the way and show us how to show solidarity and resistance. I also want to acknowledge the other speakers who have shared such inspiring and thought-provoking contributions. I very much feel like a baby in my social change journey compared to them. I graduated last year, and I've been lucky to work across a broad spectrum of issues, including refugee rights, welfare rights, and now I'm focusing on protest rights. And I guess I hope that the reflections and some of the poetry that I'll share today can be a bit of a window into the often uncertain and difficult and challenging exploration that I think we all face when we try and think about changing some of these huge issues that we've seen explored today. So because the things that I want to talk to you about today are too big sometimes to fit into ordinary language, I want to begin with a poem. This poem is by Paul Celan, who was born into a Jewish family in Chernivtsi, which is on the territory of modern-day Ukraine. Celan's mother and father were murdered in the Holocaust, and Celan himself barely survived a labor camp before being forced to flee to France to escape the Soviet Union. The poem is called All Souls. And I think that getting into the poetry headspace can be a bit tricky sometimes. I find it tricky. So perhaps I invite you to maybe close your eyes as you listen to this, just to be able to feel it a little bit better. What did I do? Seminated the night as though there could be others more nocturnal than this one. Bird flight, stone flight, 1,000 described routes, glances purloined and plucked. The sea tasted, drunk away, dreamed away, an hour soul eclipsed. The next, an autumn light, offered up to a blind feeling which came that way. Others, many with no place but their own heavy centers, glimpsed and avoided. Foundlings, stars, black, full of language, named after an oath which silence annulled. And once, when, that too is forgotten, felt the barb where my pulse dared the counter beat. I turn to this poem when I want to try to communicate or comprehend the impossible. How can it be that the streets I grew up in Kiev are being shelled? How can it be that my childhood friends are now forced to pick up a rifle and go to war? How can it be that similar suffering in Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Palestine, Burma is ignored or indeed caused by the same governments that condemn what is happening in Ukraine? And how can it be that the Australian government extends the suffering of people fleeing these wars through imprisonment, poverty, and exploitation? When I consider these impossible questions, and they are pretty impossible, I turn in part to Christianity as a faith, the stories of which were woven through my childhood in Ukraine. I wasn't part of any specific denomination, but my mother would always go to the church where the priest gave the most creative sermons. And I'm not a practicing Christian today, but I think it helps for us to be able to take the stories we are surrounded by that are woven into our being and find in them the seed of liberation, something that helps us spark up other people or indeed to illuminate things that are difficult to look at. The story of Palm Sunday and Jesus' crucifixion is one I come back to because it asks the question we are all trying to grapple with. What is to be done with the suffering we witness in the world? What can be done when we are confronted by state violence, inequality, and injustice? I think of the story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey, heading to the temple, and immediately staging a protest against the economic exploitation perpetrated by religious authorities there. I think of the anti-protest laws being passed across this continent. I think of one of my friends who recently spent 3 weeks in prison for thinking about protesting. I think of the immense power of the Roman Empire. and its doctrine of bureaucratic violence and violent bureaucracy. I think of the Australian state, which with bureaucratic banality imprisons refugees or sends them back to their homelands to die. I think of the refugee mother whose legal case I worked on, who was living in a neighbour's storage unit with her 2 young kids because the Australian refugee visa system didn't allow her to access any welfare support. I think of the refugee son I worked with who wasn't able to travel home to be with his dying father in Iran because the Australian refugee visa system doesn't allow you to visit your home country. I think of how the government attempts to sell itself as a helper of refugees from Ukraine or Afghanistan while placing them in this same cruel administrative gridlock. I think of the immense military power of the Roman state at whose hands Jesus was crucified. I think of Australia selling huge quantities of arms to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates who used them against civilians in Yemen. I think of the Australian military sent into the Northern Territory in 2007, tearing apart First Nations communities. And the billions of dollars currently being invested in nuclear submarines. And I want to note that today it's the 77th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima. And to note that it is as important now as it was in the 1960s, 70s, and indeed in the 1940s to continue to campaign for nuclear disarmament. I think of the system of debt, slavery, and exploitation that powered the Roman Empire, and the central role that the rejection of this exploitation played in Jesus' teachings and his crucifixion. I think of the companies profiteering of detention centres and the government that pays them. I think of Australia's contribution to life-wrecking climate change that is already forcing people to flee their homes, and the continued commitment to over 100 fossil fuel projects by the current Labor government. And in all of this, I think of Jesus on the cross asking, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think how many times I have asked that when faced with the immense weight of all this suffering and the powerlessness it is so common to feel with it. Here I turn to the theologian Jürgen Moltmann, who was conscripted into the German army at the age of 16, and in the midst of the Allied bombing of Hamburg, asked, where is God in all this? Where is God in the suffering and the pain of this world? After being released from a POW camp, Moltmann spent his life trying to understand the impossible suffering he was part of perpetrating, and paradoxically, also a victim of. I think here of the violence of conscription in Russia and elsewhere. In his book, The Crucified God, Moltmann looks to the crucifixion as a moment of joy and suffering that gives us a grounding for action despite all hope, despite our despair. In what Moltmann calls effective hope, we do not flee from the unbearable pressure of the present into a consoling, better future, but draw the other human future into our present and live already by it. In other words, our hope when it comes to suffering is not that we will be able to escape it by means of consoling lies or half-truths about the true nature of our government, our true treatment of refugees, or our true role in systems that perpetuate war and exploitation. Our hope is also not that we will be able to end all suffering forever. Indeed, we may only be able to reduce it by what feels like a vanishingly small amount. Our hope, or mine at least, is that when we feel confronted by the suffering of victims of state violence, of refugees, of the devastation of climate change, that this felt pain becomes a ground of truth and clarity about the system that causes it, and the alternative futures that we can bring into the present through collective action. I don't pretend to know what that might look like for each of us. It might look like joining the school strikes for climate that are so powerfully bringing together school students and workers to fight for a better future. It might look like joining the fight for refugee rights on this continent. It might look like calling out warmongering by our leaders. In my own experience, coming to what action looks like for you is unpredictable and starts with paying attention to what gets you riled up. When I was a law student in 2020, what got me riled up was police violence against protesters. One day I was eating lunch with some friends on the uni lawns and a protest walks past. I wasn't even part of the protest, mind you, because for a long time I was too shy to participate in things like that. And I saw a man who had spontaneously joined the protest be pulled aside by police and told that he was protesting illegally. And then he was accused of resisting police when he asked how what he was doing was illegal. I saw him handcuffed and put in the back of a police van. I felt fear for him because he was alone, and because he was a dark-skinned man, and we are all acutely aware of the increased risk non-white people face from police. And I had no idea what to do. I had studied law for 4 years. I was sitting with a group of friends who had also studied law for 4 years, and I couldn't think of what to do in that moment. And I couldn't stop thinking about that for the rest of the day, about how powerless I felt to help. And then I went home and I started Googling protests, policing, accountability, and I came across something called legal observing, which involves observing police at protests to keep them accountable and offering support to people impacted by police behaviour. There was a legal observing organisation in Victoria and Queensland, but not in New South Wales. So I started reaching out to people who I thought might be interested, mostly people I didn't know. So I would be calling, Amnesty Australia and just asking them, do you know anyone who's interested in this? And eventually I found out there were some people who had organised legal observing for the Black Lives Matter March in July, that there were some great First Nations activists doing work in this space. And through a lot of dead ends and awkward conversations, we ended up getting a collective up and running called Legal Observers New South Wales, which now fields observing teams to most major protests in Sydney to keep police on notice and provide protesters with legal support and information about their rights. When I next saw a protester being arrested by police at the 2021 Invasion Day, one of our legal observers was next to him, giving him the number for a legal hotline we had set up. And another legal observer was getting his details so we could keep track of him. And later, another legal observer met him outside the police station for a drive home. That didn't happen because I, as an individual, knew what I was doing, or I had a straight line from that moment in 2020 to that moment in 2021. It happened because I paid attention to what got me riled up, and I trusted other people would care about it too and would find ways to do something about it. You don't have to have the answers right now. It certainly took me a lot of trial and error and getting involved with groups and initiatives and feeling the thrill of collective action and also the uncertainty and the difficulty of it. And I'm still uncertain, and I think that's a good thing. This stuff is messy and big, but the good news is that we don't have to go it alone. Acting in collective with other people you trust might not give you any final answers, but it definitely will give you hope and the ability to look at the difficult stuff directly and say, maybe we can do something about it. Let's see what that is. So I began with Celan writing at the end of the Second World War, and I want to end with another poet writing at the very beginning of the Second World War about how we can face what might seem the impossible. Here's an excerpt of September 1st, 1939 by W.H. Auden. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grow up the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Thank you.